All right, well, last week we began with some of the big themes of decolonization, talking about, in some ways, the real hot spots, the lingering geopolitical fault lines in places like the Indian subcontinent, where Britain essentially packed up and left with this timetable, about 18 months to partition. Obviously, the Palestinian Mandate, Israel-Palestine, huge issue which continues to smolder. We talked about that as kind of the biggest and most, in some ways, interesting case studies, throwing in a few of the significant events, particularly the Suez Crisis. There are a lot of different ways of looking at all of this. You could, after all, see it as a kind of rising up of the oppressed. In some ways, this was the fashionable view back then. Frantz Fanon, in France particularly, popularized this notion of necessary or even virtuous violence. That is, that the whole process was ennobling in part because it was violent. Except this may have been true in places like Algeria. It wasn't necessarily true elsewhere. The violence in a place like India, Pakistan, or what used to be known as just the Raj, that is British India, the violence came after colonization, that is after decolonization, after the British left, or I suppose more precisely while they were leaving. This wasn't as true in Israel, that is in Palestine, or what used to be just the Palestinian Mandate. A lot of the violence obviously preceded the departure. But in nearly every case, it seems that the real violence came later. That is, it's not that the violence wasn't there, it's not that the tensions weren't there, but that everything really erupted or exploded later. The question of responsibility then becomes a very interesting one. You could blame everything on the original colonizers, which does tend to be the more fashionable view. A more subtle, I think, nuanced view of the legacy of kind of decolonization is that whatever the original sin might have been, it could have happened in a better way. That is, had the departures been more gradual, better thought out with more planning. Instead, they all kind of happened all at once in a way. You know, starting again, late 1940s, you started with the Palestinian Mandate. Britain just essentially kicked the can, so to speak, over to the United Nations. With India, Pakistan, Britain essentially just again kicked the problem over to the kind of local native elites. In a way, the phrase we sometimes use in English, washing one's hands of the problem, that is, no longer our problem. This happened in an even more extreme and rapid way in Africa. It all happened in the course of about 6 or 7 years. You know, between really the aftermath of the Suez Crisis in the middle 1960s, virtually every major African colony was abandoned. The last holdout was, I believe, Angola of the Portuguese. The Portuguese, oddly enough, held out longer than the other powers, in part because, as a kind of has-been, also ran power. Maybe the Portuguese were a little keener to hold on to what remained of their dwindling international prestige. They also had a bit more skin in the game in the sense that the Portuguese were actually still involved in things like the native slave trade, whereas Britain and France had long since washed their hands of that. Belgium also left at about the same time. I mean, I talk mostly about Britain and France in this lecture, but of course, in some ways, the Belgian legacy is even more explosive and controversial. Not just because of the Congo, the former Belgian Congo as it's called, with the whole saga involving Lumumba and later Mobutu, or as he liked to call himself, the cock that leaves no hens alone. In addition to the Congo, there was, of course, Rwanda, which is in some ways the most notorious of all, at least since the massacres of the 1990s. If you've seen the movie, actually a very, very good movie made with Don Cheadle called Hotel Rwanda, which looks at that episode. It may have come as a surprise to some people to learn that Rwanda had been a Belgian colony of all things. It actually, before it was a Belgian colony, oddly enough, it was a German colony. It was part of Germany's original kind of Southeast African empire, which had been turned over to the Belgians in the settlement of Versailles after the First World War. But so the Belgian role is obviously important too. But the real political impetus behind decolonization came from the two key powers, Britain and France, who had, of course, between them carved up the vast bulk of Africa. Yeah, the Belgians had an important role too, but they were in a way just following the lead of the British and the French. So how and why did it happen when it did? A mistake I think historians often make, along with those who draw on the work of historians like journalists, is assuming that things had to happen the way that they did. Not really. Britain did not have to withdraw from India or from the Palestinian Mandate after the Second World War. Britain did not have to do that. Britain did it in large part because of its impending bankruptcy, its debt burden, and particularly its inability to essentially maintain its imperial obligations. In the case of Africa, that was a bit less true. The decolonization of Africa, I think, was much more accidental in some ways. It really came about in a kind of great rush of almost spontaneous, again, just let's be done with it. Let's just withdraw. Partly out of a mixture of guilt and lingering bad feelings, partly just out of a disgust with, I suppose, the complications of the duties that these imperial powers still had to do, partly out of the fact that the colonies really weren't doing a whole lot for them anyway. But mostly it was just a matter of will. It was a matter of, more precisely, the lack of will, or the weakening of what had once been a much stronger will. A sudden decision just to go like that. No, we're done. Now, the key impetus was, of course, the Suez Crisis, which we talked about the other day. The real legacy of the Suez Crisis in terms of international politics, yeah, in the short run it blew up Nasser's ego because, you know, he had stood up to, as he liked to think of it, the Western powers. Although, of course, it's a little strange that Egyptian forces were actually routed by Israel in the field, and the interpretation that Nasser liked to popularize was that, in fact, Israel had done this only because of Britain and France, whereas Britain and France had accomplished almost nothing in the crisis. The main reason, of course, was that the Americans had pulled the rug out from under them. Literally, in the case of Britain, by shorting the pound sterling, a little bit like everyone is today shorting the US dollar. But anyway, the US at the time had all the financial leverage and muscle. They essentially told the British, they told Eden just to go shove it. Eisenhower was livid because of the timing. It was at the height of the presidential election campaign. He also thought the whole thing was a mistake. So anyway, the Americans basically told Britain and France to stop, and they stopped. It was humiliating, it discredited them. More to the point, it showed that they were no longer really great powers. That is, a great power that cannot bully a tin pot dictator like Nasser in Egypt is no longer a great power. Particularly if it turns out that Britain and France could not do this because they didn't have American permission. It was a humiliating blow for both powers. Now, France was, of course, also engaged in, or I suppose more to the point, was disengaging violently and gradually from Algeria. You know, we talked a bit about that sort of colonial war the other day. Brutalities on both sides were legion, were particularly horrible. The FLN, you know, again, responding to many French atrocities, eventually got to the point where they were not only targeting soldiers, they were targeting civilians, they were targeting women, children. They even had a slogan at one point, which was that there's something like the death of a suit was worth the death of 200 soldiers, by which they meant a suit, a person wearing a suit, like a civilian, you know, businessman or administrator. So they were targeting civilians. The French would often go after and, you know, burn down entire villages. It was a horrible war that was getting even more horrible in the 1950s. The question was, of course, what France would do about it. It seems simple just to say, well, you withdraw, you disengage. But of course, in all of these wars, Vietnam being another example, once you're engaged, you then have these moral dilemmas. It's not just that all these French settlers, the pieds noirs, that is, the French white colonial settlers, along with the natives who have kind of gone along with them, who work for French companies, you know, who help out the French army, who maybe serve in the government, all of them are invested in the French presence. All of them are, of course, inevitably going to be targeted if the FLN wins. Much like in Vietnam, the so-called boat people eventually left and tried to make it to America, along with, of course, many other people from Indochina, the Hmong among them. If you've seen this recent Clint Eastwood movie, Gran Torino, you learn about these mountain peoples who just basically, because they took the American side, they later had to leave. It was the same thing. If France disengages, they have hundreds of thousands of people who are probably going to be targeted by the FLN. So what do? You know, do you disengage? Do you double down on a bad bet? There are no easy answers. De Gaulle essentially took the interesting position of sort of promising everything at once. He gave this famous speech. I meant to talk about this last week, but it's a great phrase in French. Now, he goes to Algeria. He addresses all of these people again who are invested in the continuation of the French presence there. The civil officials, the military leaders, the officers, the natives, the corporate leaders. A bunch of them are all together, and he tells them, "Je vous ai compris. I have understood you." This is a very, very clever skill that many politicians have. You make people think that you agree with them. All you're really saying is, I understand your point of view. You don't want us to leave. You want us to stand with you. I have understood you. That doesn't mean I'm going to do what you want, but I have understood you. That's what he said. So they all thought that meant France was going to stay. Whereas within about a month of this, France had begun to withdraw. And so he essentially lied to everyone about his intentions. It was a brilliant speech which quieted the mood. It helped ensure in the short run his essential coup d'etat back in France, essentially showing that he had the support of the Pieds Noirs and the settlers in Algeria, that he had some solution. As soon as he had set up the Fifth Republic, with these, of course, famously broad, sweeping powers for the president, currently, of course, an office held by Sarkozy, this constitution, the setup, the new regime under de Gaulle, once he had all this in place, he just withdrew. Again, washed his hands of the problem. And yes, there were boatloads of refugees who all swept into the south of France, fleeing in terror from, of course, the vengeful mob. Not the mob. I mean, it was more like a mob fleeing the FLN and its basically vengeful intentions towards them. So France withdraws. There's a bloodbath of sorts. The exodus continues on for the next several decades. It's not exactly, shall we say, a shining moment in the history of France, although de Gaulle's perspective was he was, again, cutting France's losses and leaving when they could. De Gaulle then essentially gave another speech, and he offered France's colonies the option of seceding, that is, from the French Empire. Do you want to be independent? He just asked them. Well, okay. He didn't ask all of the individual subjects, of course. He asked various committees of politicians, intellectuals, reformers, etc., who were interested in the question. This is always true. You can never really canvass the opinion of everyone. This was a big issue in India, for example. A country of then 400 or 500 million people, today more than 1 billion. How do you really know what everyone thinks there? You probably don't. I think I mentioned this survey before that was taken shortly after independence in India, asking people if they were, happy that the British had left. And the most popular answer was actually, who are the British? A lot of them didn't even know who the British were. That is, the people who live in these small villages, who speak their own dialects, who didn't know English, who didn't know Hindustani, or maybe they knew just a small dialect, but they didn't even know who was running the country. It's the political nation that matters. That is, it's the educated people, in many cases the people who had been educated in France, or of course, in the case of India, people like Nehru, who had of course been educated in England. Those were the people who spoke the language of modern politics. Who also tended to think that because they had that education, that they had almost a duty, certainly a right, to lead these countries. And so, as you might expect, most of these people said, oui, yes. Not all of them. Interestingly, I tried to write the list here. The no answers were from Guinea and Madagascar. They actually said they wanted to remain in the French Empire. Virtually all of the other countries of France's African Empire, including Ivory Coast, Madagascar, Senegal, Chad, Gabon, Mauritania, and Cameroon, said, oui, we do want to be independent. So it was voluntary. France just basically said, look, do you want to be independent? Fine. Yes, there were certain assumptions that French investments would be respected, property rights would be respected, etc., etc. Due compensation would be given if property were nationalized. There are all those sorts of assumptions. And there was also, I think, a kind of implied assumption that the context between the elites would remain, the elites who spoke French, or of course in the case of the British colonies, who spoke English. So you could say, on the one hand, from the moral point of view, this was admirable. France said, what do you want? They asked the colonies themselves what they wanted. Britain didn't even ask. Britain just left, basically. In Britain's case, the key speech, which is remembered by posterity, was given by Harold Macmillan It was in Cape Town, South Africa, February 1960. Again, it's like this momentum is building. It's a wave. It's just, this is the time. We're going to allow history to proceed. We're not going to stand in its way. He called it the winds of change. An interesting phrase in that it implies, again, an essential passivity. There's no human agency. Things are just happening the way they're happening. So we're going to allow it to happen. Now, which is, in a manner of speaking, accurate. In another manner of speaking, it's actually a lie. If you allow things to continue on the way they were, that would probably imply that Britain would continue administering its empire. Instead, Britain unilaterally disengaged from its empire. That is, not only abandoned its sovereign claim on these territories, but abandoned most of the sense of responsibility. Yes, there were still people in place, in places like Kenya. Kenya even at times had white heads of state. South Africa is a more interesting case, because there the British did disengage. People get confused about this sometimes. It had been a crown colony of the British Empire. It's true that the new rulers, of course, mostly the descendants of the so-called Boers, or the Dutch, they did rule the country under a kind of rigid system of white supremacy known as apartheid. But that said, that was their choice. It was not the British choice. The British left. The British left and allowed them to run things their own way. They actually, voluntarily and in some ways aggressively withdrew from the Commonwealth, in part because the British did not approve of apartheid. So the British, again, they're disengaging voluntarily, unilaterally, and without even the input of a kind of referendum like the French held. They just said, we're done. Have it your way. Go your own way. See how you do. Jolly good. Good luck to you. And there you go. Now again, the two ways of looking at this I think are fascinating. You could say, well, that's great. I mean, it's long overdue. They should have done this a long time ago. On the other hand, you could say, well, but you have now begun to impose your own culture and institutions. A place like Sudan, for example. It wasn't just a matter of cricket, for example, and the English language. They built a lot of buildings, right? They built bridges. They built huge, imposing edifices. They built roads. They built hospitals. All of those places needed now to be run and administered. And yes, they had trained a kind of native elite in all of these places to do so. But things never quite turned out the way they had been before. It wasn't always like a quick run, down into oblivion immediately, but there was a general running down of these institutions in almost all of the former colonies. With different speed, different emphasis in different places. Why was this? Why couldn't these institutions continue functioning the same way they did before? Why did the parliaments tend to get taken over by the kind of one-party dictatorships that they did? Why did the hospitals continue on for a while, but eventually lose some of their effectiveness, some of them then being abandoned and so on? Why did this happen this way? I mean, they're fascinating questions. I actually think one of the most interesting accounts of this, it was written by a doctor, himself British. And this is true of a lot of Brits born in the last 50 or 60 years. Nearly all of them had some connection to the colonies. Maybe it was their parents, maybe their grandparents. Maybe they served in the army, many of them, because until the late 1950s, they actually did have universal military service. I think it was 1959 when they finally abolished universal military service after the Second World War. So people would serve in these countries, and most of them had a fairly, shall we say, positive attitude towards the empire. Not all of them. Eventually, I think there was a more general pervasive sense of almost like guilt about the empire. But in that era, people, I think, still had a good view. Anyway, this guy was a doctor. He spent a lot of time in Kenya. He worked in a hospital there. He talked about how it was basically paradise because he wasn't paid that much money, but the cost of living was low. You could afford servants, of course, very easily. So he lived this life where he felt like he was doing a good deed, so he felt good about himself and his work. He was helping to obviously improve the health of the native population. He was also helping to train native doctors so they could themselves learn this. And he said this was all great. I mean, we had time because we had servants, we had time to spend with our friends, time to pursue our interests, time to enjoy the weather, to enjoy all of the native kind of delicacies of Kenya, the fruits and so on. And he said, our lives were perfect. After a while, though, I started to notice that many of the native doctors who worked in the hospital, who made the same salary that I did, their lives were not the same. They had the same training. Many of them had been to England. They had the same capacities and skills. You know, they were not inferior doctors. They actually made the same amount of money. But their lives were radically different. They might even live in an identical house. But the thing is, their house would rapidly be invaded by all of their hangers-on relatives. Eventually you'd have goats tramping through. You'd have, animals. You'd have essentially the whole native culture imposing itself upon this tiny little outpost, you might say, of European culture. The main thing you had, of course, was that if you were lucky enough to have been educated in the mother country in England, if you were a native Kenyan, and then you came back, you would have all of these other people who would see you as a meal ticket. All of your cousins and relatives, and they would all basically try to impose whatever the tribe demanded on you. And so your income would get split in like 47 different ways. You'd had all of these people relying on you. Maybe the pressure would be too much, and you would eventually fold. It left a real legacy of a kind of bad blood of resentment. Sometimes resentment even of good deeds. I mean, psychologically, I think, it's not that the British didn't perpetrate crimes at times, and the French did too. But in some ways, I think the quote-unquote good deeds in some ways rankled more. It's a great psychological insight to say that if you want someone to really admire you, to like you, to have good feelings towards you, you don't do them a favor. You have them do you a favor. Because gratitude grates. You don't like being reminded that these people supposedly did these nice things for you. You don't like being reminded that they built this hospital which you didn't build on your own. There's actually a very important contemporary legacy to some of this. Some of you might know, of course, about Barack Obama's origins, current President of the United States. You know where his family is from. It's from Kenya. They're actually, interestingly, his father is from the Luo tribe. This is one of the reasons that they're a part of this, particularly in East Africa. There's a little bit of a division that's like, it's actually more than tribal, it's larger than tribal, between the tall peoples and the short ones. Famously in Rwanda, you might have heard, if you watch this movie, the line, "Cut down the tall trees." The Tutsis are much taller than the Hutus. In Kenya, you have the same sort of a divide between the Kikuyu, mostly majority, who were kind of a little shorter. They're not particularly short, but they're not as tall as the Luo. Anyway, Obama comes from this tribe. I mean, his father does anyway. They're particularly tall, and they actually have very, very dark skin, which is one of the interesting things about Obama's background, is that he is able to sort of, qualify, as it were, in American politics as black, despite the fact that he's actually mostly white by ancestry. And it's partly because the Luo tribe have, very, very dark black skin. So that even though, he's only maybe like a quarter African black, he looks black. Which matters, because in American politics, particularly if you want to have, the votes of blacks, they don't want to see him as, like a sort of a traitor or, someone who's not legitimately black. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but his first major election in 2000, he ran against a black candidate in Chicago, and he got destroyed. He lost like 70% to 30%. He later gerrymandered the district so that there were more white people and Jews. So that in a way, curiously, he's like a crossover. He has a colonial black background, but he's also part white. And I think in some ways that is why he's able to bridge the gap politically. But so the interesting thing about Obama's background, although like a lot of people of mixed parentage, logic might suggest that he would, shall we say, admire more his mother's side of the family. It was his grandparents who raised him. His father, of course, abandoned him when he was like 1.5. But interestingly, that isn't the way he saw things. His father's background was simply more interesting. When he visited Kenya, he looked up the members of the tribe. He has all these relatives there. He was fascinated by it. It's a little bit like the longing for roots that a lot of people have. So he went back to Kenya, and this became a very important part of his identity. And a big part of it, of course, is resentment of the British. One of the very first things that Obama's administration kind of did that was controversial in American politics, I don't know if you heard this story, but he sent back the bust of Winston Churchill to England that had been in the White House. Because, again, he has this kind of resentment complex that still exists. I actually think it's rather ironic that in the current Libyan campaign that Obama's administration has actually gone in with Britain and France. I think Obama is probably very conflicted about this. because he and his father, I mean, his father was, again, he was one of the elites. The Luo tribe, they tend to be better educated. They tend to be more kind of English speaking. His father might have even been a CIA agent. There are some people who think that he was, because he had a lot of contacts with the Americans, and that's how he eventually met his American wife. He got various grants, he went to Harvard and all of this other stuff. But anyway, so they're kind of from the elites in Kenya. The people who you might think would be, in some ways, the closest to, the Americans and the British. But in some ways, the closer you are to them, the more you resent the differences. So that in a place like Kenya, I think the legacy, it wasn't just various things that the British had done to divide the tribes and so on. In some ways, it was actually the very success which people resented. And in other places like Zimbabwe, of course, it was even more blunt. I mean, Mugabe came to power in the late 70s and just literally set about dispossessing white farmers. That's just pure racial revenge, which in a way is not surprising. It is part of, I think, the, shall we say, the moral dilemmas or legacy, or it's not even a dilemma really. I mean, it's easy to understand where the resentment comes from. In this case, the most successful farmers in the country were still white settlers. The fact that they were successful and that they enriched the country, basically, was less important to, of course, Mugabe than the political dynamic of it. Which was, well, we want to be independent of them. I mean, that in some ways is, I think, the real key political fact, the geopolitical fact of the modern era. You have this upwelling of Western power which kind of sweeps over the world. And as it has receded, you have, of course, this lingering resentment almost everywhere. We talked about it in China. With Mao, yes, there's the element that communism was a Western invention. You can definitely say that. On the other hand, Chiang Kai-shek's regime was, of course, much closer to the West. Even the Soviet ambassador, if you remember, left with Chiang Kai-shek. Mao's movement represented the anti-foreign sentiment. As we're going to see in the second half of today's lecture, that gave it, I think, a political impetus and dynamism. We're going to see where this eventually leads in China. And it's pretty extreme when they really get into the expelling of the Western influence. In some ways you could say it wasn't as bad as it could have been in Africa. It's certainly examples of countries like Zimbabwe with a anti-white campaign. South Africa, where it goes the other way, where you have the apartheid of the white settlers. Although, of course, that has begun to reverse itself today. In some ways, it's actually surprising that things weren't worse, that there wasn't even more racial resentment, even more anti-Western sentiment. But that said, the problem with a lot of the anti-Western sentiment was that it eventually did create problems that probably didn't need to be there. In some ways, I think the Cold War intersected with this. We talked about this a little bit last week, how conflicts which might have had nothing to do with the Cold War, like Vietnam, for example, which was a classic anti-colonial sort of a battle waged by Ho Chi Minh, first against the French, later the Americans, eventually got subsumed into this Cold War framework. People, you might say, exploited the Cold War in this sense. In Africa, the way this tended to happen was that the new anti-colonial, anti-Western movements would usually embrace, whether the Soviet side, not necessarily they would become communists, but they would embrace the rhetoric of the Soviet bloc. And particularly, they would embrace the whole notion of Marxism, as is sometimes called Afro-Marxism, which meant very simply the nationalization of property. So you had a country like the Congo, an incredibly rich country as we know today, where people still fight over things like diamonds. There's rubber and a lot of other resources as well, but most famously the diamonds. Where Mobutu, by the time, of course, he was finally forced to leave the country, had supposedly $9 billion in his Swiss bank account, which was not incidentally roughly the amount of money given in Western aid to Zaire over the past 30 years. You had these dictators who simply said, look, it all belongs to me now. And Marxism gave them a convenient pseudo-doctrine to justify this. It didn't happen everywhere in the same way, but basically what you eventually got in most of these countries was some variety of dictatorship. And there were different flavors. I think one of the best quotes was Nkrumah of Ghana. Nkrumah, I don't know if I wrote his name up here, but he was one of these leaders who had been, you might say, intoxicated or even corrupted by this great anti-colonial congress at Bandung, that is in Indonesia in 1955. where it's partly the problem is that you get these people together, and once they're together, they all share something in common, which is it's partly this myth that they represent the people of the earth, even though they may very well just represent themselves. That is the idea that whatever they're doing is on behalf of the human race, which is trying to, again, expel the legacy of the West. So that he ends up saying something like this: all Africans know that I represent Africa and speak in her name. Therefore, no African can have an opinion different from mine. Therefore, you get the imprisonment of political opponents, you get the importation of a kind of Soviet-style secret police, and eventually you get, shall we say, governance which does not respect human rights. Nkrumah was by no means the worst of these kind of African dictators who emerged from the colonial era. Mobutu was pretty horrible in Zaire, Congo. He actually had, though, I think, the greatest of all the names. When he decided that people could no longer take Western Christian names, he actually renamed himself. I'm going to try to get the whole name here. It was Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Nimideru Wazabanga, which translated into English means the cock that leaves no hens alone. This is a very ominous sounding phrase. Whether or not you're a woman, of course, who comes into his path. It could also mean, of course, that he doesn't leave the people alone. Watching them, looking into everyone's windows, seeing what they're doing. Very, very ominous. I did write up, I think, Nyerere's name. Now, his regime was particularly interesting in that, I think I mentioned before the Woody Allen movie Bananas. He was talking more about South American dictatorships, but the joke there was, the new dictator comes to power, and he says, from now on, you must change your underwear 3 times a day, and you must wear it on outside of pants, so we can check. And you think that sounds crazy, but then you have people like Nyerere who decides, he went back and forth about whether you were supposed to wear Western clothes, then he decided you weren't supposed to wear Western clothes. And so he finally decided then that Western clothes meant one thing, pants meant something, skirts meant something else, but that basically women weren't supposed to wear pants, and that to make sure that they weren't wearing pants, they could be rubbed down and groped by the soldiers. And so you had this massive thing he created. It was actually called a youth league. And any girl who was wearing a Western-style skirt or pants that were too tight would have them stripped off. This was actual regime policy, I kid you not. But this was like comedic. You can kind of laugh about this. In Uganda, it wasn't so funny. Some of you might have even been exposed to this. Another recent Hollywood movie, which is actually pretty good, called The Last King of Scotland. Has anyone seen it? Yeah. Yeah. So she was kicked out by Amin. I don't know whether to believe all of the stories about Idi Amin in Uganda, but some of them are pretty shocking. He was, in some ways he was like a Nasser. He was an army officer who took over, he expelled, the leaders. A lot of people left the country. There was an anti-Western sentiment, but there was also anti-Asian sentiment. That's another thing which has not always been appreciated, because the British Empire really, it was like a multinational concern. So there was a lot of movement of peoples, particularly from the Indian subcontinent. You said your grandmother was, oh, your mother was actually born there, I see. Right, so there was a huge, of course, Asian and particularly Indian population which had come to Africa, and many of them were in skilled occupations. Many of them were educated. They certainly spoke English. And so they tended to be resented. There's an interesting phrase which was coined by Amy Chua. There was a book she published about, I guess, 8 years ago called World on Fire. And her idea was that globalization, although it did help expand wealth, also exposed all of these tense fault lines of ethnic resentment. In her case, because she was Chinese, her family actually came from Indonesia, and so they had actually been persecuted for being Chinese in Indonesia. A classic case of what she called the market-dominant minority. That is a group which, because it is so successful, becomes like a focal point for all of the resentment. So that it might be the Jews, of course, in many places, not least Europe, even Germany. It might be the Chinese, who as a kind of merchant class spread through Asia. In Africa, it might have been these Indian settlers, who would come in kind of like the back of the British Empire and ended up taking up many of the better jobs and positions and so on. To some extent, you could even say, like in Rwanda, it was a case of the Tutsis being a native version of that. You know, again, the tall, somewhat better educated tribe, which was resented by the other majority. You know, so that Idi Amin, he played on all of this. I mean, it was like he was a mixture of a bunch of pathologies. You had the anti-colonialist extremism. He converted to Islam. That was a part of his identity, so that there was also an anti-Christian thing. But I think much more important than that was this notion that he could divide and conquer between the different groups. He could play on these resentment of the Westerners, resentment of the Asians. I mean, in some ways, the regime, I think, was even more anti-Asian than anti-Western. Not least because Idi Amin actually liked alcohol, so he was kind of he wasn't like a very sincere, you might say, believing Muslim in that sense. You know, supposedly they had a weekly whiskey run coming in from Stansted Airport, you know, in England. So his regime, I mean, there were all kinds of hypocrisies and so on, but the stories about his regime were truly horrifying. I mean, it started with things when he was kind of coming to power and he was in the army. Supposedly, you know, when his soldiers would, you know, kill some of the opposition, they would leave them out in the open so that hyenas would eat their bodies. That was one of the first stories. Then, supposedly, to get the soldiers to confess, he would threaten to castrate them. And some of them, apparently, he actually did castrate. And then eventually, once he was in power and they were beginning again to, you know, arrest political opponents, there were all these weirdnesses. Like he liked to have cocktails with his victims before they were killed and decapitated and mutilated. Like he had like a secret chamber, supposedly, from his office. He would invite them in and, you know, he'd have some whiskey and some cocktails. And then he would send them to the, you know, torturers and the executioners. There were rumors of cannibalism. You know, horrible stories which were coming from people who worked for his regime. I mean, the stories were not just like made up by foreigners. These were the stories that foreigners heard from the people working for him. You know, many of whom eventually left themselves in terror. He actually supposedly killed some of the cabinet ministers with his bare hands. Like he just literally like strangled them to death. Anyway, rumors of cannibalism, all of this stuff was rampant. All of it was well known, publicized around the world. The reason I mention this is just because as a kind of, I think, you know, perverse low in this sad legacy of decolonization, he was invited, of course, to address the United Nations, 1975. He denounced Israel, the West, etc. This speech wasn't very interesting. It was just the usual stuff. He got a standing ovation. And then he was invited to a banquet by the Secretary General, where they toasted and feted him in 1975. After the world already knew about all of these stories. Now, maybe people didn't believe them. I suppose that's always possible. Maybe people didn't believe all of the stories, or they thought they were exaggerated. But I think there's something more to it. I think he represented, aside from a lot of, again, you know, pathological kind of violence, because he was speaking against the West, people tended to discount a lot of that, and they kind of gave him a pass. I mean, one way of looking at it is this. There's a double standard. There are a lot of double standards in the world. I mean, we all know about the double standard about men and women, right? That, you know, men can misbehave, and it's just chalked up to youthful indiscretion. Women misbehave, and it tends to affect their reputations. Double standard, you might say, of violence is this. When Africans kill other Africans, people don't seem to take that much notice of it. They don't issue UN resolutions. They don't go on crusades. They may be sad about it. They may get upset about it. But in a curious way, I think people condescend. Well, that's just the way they are. Now, that's very sad. But I'll give you an example of this. I mean, all the wars people talked about in like the 1990s and, you know, on through the 2010s, wars in Bosnia, Kosovo, people were talking about these horrible crimes in Yugoslavia. You know, people were talking about, you know, obviously eventually like the Iraq War and things like that. In the Congo, a war was going on. 3 million people died. We heard almost nothing about it. You know, should you intervene? I mean, this is the new doctrine they're talking about now in the White House. Samantha Power, you might have heard her name. She's one of Obama's key advisors. Samantha Power, in some ways, cut her teeth not only on Bosnia, but on Rwanda. Not that she was there, but that she kind of wrote about it. She calls herself actually a genocide chick, you know, by which she means she's someone who gets interested in genocides, wants people to stop them, obviously. So she eventually figured out that the way to do this is to become an advisor to the president. And so she's now, whispering in Obama's ear, and she's the one, according to rumor, who convinced him to intervene in Libya. Whether for good or for ill, I don't know. I think the jury is still out. But this is the notion then. She thinks it is an outrage that the West did not intervene in Rwanda or in a place like the Congo. And she may be right. I mean, it shows a kind of double standard, right? Again, the West intervenes in some places where it seems like people are outraged about what's going on, but then doesn't pay attention to these other places. Well, that's just the way they behave. There's a good line in that movie Blood Diamond about this. Where Jaimin Hunsu and his character. Has any of you seen this movie? It came out a couple of years. And he's kind of talking about, well, maybe they think this is just something in the black man's heart. I mean, that's condescending, and that's sad if that's true, that that's what people expect, out of these countries. But of course, the dilemma is not an easy one. Had the US or some other country tried to intervene in a place like Rwanda, we don't know. Maybe it would have made things worse. There's just no way of knowing this. The fact that Belgians, had been there to begin with probably didn't help. But then maybe the fact that they left made things worse. Libya, for example. The West supposedly intervened to prevent a massacre in Benghazi. In the long run, maybe more lives will be lost because of the intervention. We just don't know that. There are no real easy answers to these questions. It's just, I'm always suspicious, though, when I hear anyone get on their soapbox, so to speak, and moralize about it. Blood Diamond, the movie, is a perfect example of this. It's actually a bit weird, too, in that there's a big speech right at the end where they say, we want to hear the voice of the African speaking, and then Jaimin Hunsu goes up to the microphone, and then they just go to the credits. You don't actually hear him saying anything. It's really funny. Like they say, we want to hear, the voice of the African, the innocent African of all these wars speaking. And then he goes and he doesn't say anything, which is a bit odd. The other odd thing about it is there's this kind of anti-diamond industry motif in the movie, the idea that the diamond industry is profiting and all the rest of this. And I just have to say, some people are incredibly naive. Think about this. Blood diamonds, the concept, the campaign. We want to keep conflict diamonds off the market. Okay, so what happens if you keep diamonds off the market? What happens to the price of diamonds? It goes up. Who do you think is behind the campaign? It's the diamond industry. Okay, I'm not saying I have proof, but you have to look a little deeper. Yes, it's true that these wars are terrible and that it's terrible to think that people are giving wedding rings which are helping to fuel the violence in Africa. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. A lot of these people who may think that they are participating in a good cause, they may actually be unwittingly improving the bottom line of De Beers. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for now because the next subject is very, very large, and we want to give enough time to China. We're going to take about 10 minutes then. And when we get back, we're going to look at decolonization in Asia. Virtuous violence, that is, that the whole process was ennobling in part because it was violent. Except this may have been true in places like Algeria. It wasn't necessarily true elsewhere. The violence in a place like India, Pakistan, or what used to be known as just the Raj, that is British India, the violence came after colonization, that is after decolonization, after the British left, or I suppose more precisely while they were leaving. This wasn't as true in Israel, that is in Palestine, or what used to be just the Palestinian Mandate. A lot of the violence obviously preceded the departure. But in nearly every case, it seems that the real violence came later. That is, it's not that the violence wasn't there, it's not that the tensions weren't there, but that everything really erupted or exploded later. The question of responsibility then becomes a very interesting one. You could blame everything on the original colonizers, which does tend to be the more fashionable view. A more subtle, I think, nuanced view of the legacy of kind of decolonization is that whatever the original sin might have been, it could have happened in a better way, that is, had the departures been more gradual. All right, well, Last week we began with some of the big themes of decolonization, talking about in some ways the real hot spots, the lingering geopolitical fault lines in places like the Indian subcontinent, where Britain essentially packed up and left with this timetable about 18 months to partition. Obviously the Palestinian Mandate, Israel-Palestine, huge issue which continues to smolder. We talked about that as kind of the biggest and most, in some ways, interesting case studies. Throwing in a few of the significant events, particularly the Suez Crisis. There are a lot of different ways of looking at all of this. You could, after all, see it as a kind of rising up of the oppressed. In some ways, this was the fashionable view back then. Frantz Fanon, in France particularly, popularized this notion of necessary, or even the real political impetus behind decolonization came from the two key powers, Britain and France, who had, of course, between them carved up the vast bulk of Africa. Yeah, the Belgians had an important role too, but they were in a way just following the lead of the British and the French. So how and why did it happen when it did? A mistake I think historians often make, along with those who draw on the work of historians like journalists, is assuming that things had to happen the way that they did. Not really. Britain did not have to withdraw from India or from the Palestinian Mandate after the Second World War. Britain did not have to do that. Britain did it in large part because of its impending bankruptcy, its debt burden, and particularly its inability to essentially maintain its imperial obligations. In the case of Africa, that was a bit less true. The decolonization of Africa, I think, was much more accidental in some ways. It really came about in a kind of great rush of almost spontaneous, again, just let's be done with it. Let's just withdraw. Partly out of a mixture of guilt and lingering bad feelings, partly just slave trade, whereas Britain and France had long since washed their hands of that. Belgium also left at about the same time. I mean, I talk mostly about Britain and France in this lecture, but of course, in some ways, the Belgian legacy is even more explosive and controversial, not just because of the Congo, the former Belgian Congo as it's called, with the whole saga involving Lumumba and later Mobutu, or as he liked to call himself, the cock that leaves no hens alone. In addition to the Congo, there was, of course, Rwanda, which is in some ways the most notorious of all, at least since the massacres of the 1990s. If you've seen the movie, actually a very, very good movie made with Don Cheadle called Hotel Rwanda, which looks at that episode. It may have come as a surprise to some people to learn that Rwanda had been a Belgian colony of all things. It actually, before it was a Belgian colony, oddly enough, it was a German colony. It was part of Germany's original kind of Southeast African empire, which had been turned over to the Belgians in the settlement of Versailles after the First World War. But so the Belgian role is obviously important too, but better thought out with more planning. Instead, they all kind of happened all at once in a way. You know, starting again, late 1940s, you started with the Palestinian Mandate. Britain just essentially kicked the can, so to speak, over to the United Nations. With India, Pakistan, Britain essentially just again kicked the problem over to the kind of local native elites. In a way, the phrase we sometimes use in English, washing one's hands of the problem, that is, no longer our problem. This happened in an even more extreme and rapid way in Africa. It all happened in the course of about 6 or 7 years. You know, between really the aftermath of the Suez Crisis in the middle 1960s, virtually every major African colony was abandoned. The last holdout was, I believe, Angola of the Portuguese. The Portuguese, oddly enough, held out longer than the other powers, in part because, as a kind of has-been, also ran power. Maybe the Portuguese were a little keener to hold on to what remained of their dwindling international prestige. They also had a bit more skin in the game in the sense that the Portuguese were actually still involved in things like the native